The summer heat of 1672 hung thick over the Dutch Republic like a suffocating blanket. But it wasn't the weather that made citizens sweat with anxiety. War had erupted on multiple fronts, enemies circled like vultures, and whispers of betrayal echoed through every tavern and marketplace. In the corridors of power, two brothers stood at the center of a political storm that would soon consume them in ways no one could have predicted. What happened on that fateful August day would become one of history's most savage displays of mob violence, an orgy of brutality so extreme that it defied comprehension. The execution of Johann and Cornelius de Witt wasn't just a political assassination. It was a descent into primal savagery that revealed the terrifying depths of human cruelty when civilization's thin veneer finally cracks. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. The violence didn't end with their deaths. What followed was a carnival of horror that would make medieval torture chambers seem merciful by comparison. Bodies were mutilated beyond recognition, organs harvested as souvenirs, and flesh consumed in acts of cannibalism that shocked even hardened witnesses of that brutal age. Today, we're going to examine exactly what happened during those blood-soaked hours in The Hague. We'll explore how two of the most powerful men in the Dutch Republic became victims of a frenzy so savage that it was immortalized in what might be the most disturbing painting ever created. And I'm going to show you why this wasn't just random mob violence, but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign of hatred that transformed ordinary citizens into ravenous beasts. The year 1672 would go down in Dutch history as the Rampjaar, the year of disaster. France and England had declared war simultaneously, their armies and fleets bearing down on the small republic like twin hurricanes. The Dutch military, undermanned and unprepared, crumbled under the assault. Panic seized the population as enemy forces advanced deeper into their homeland, threatening to extinguish the golden age that had made the Netherlands the envy of Europe. In times of crisis, people demand someone to blame, and the mob's fury found its target in the de Witt brothers. Johann de Witt, serving as Grand Pensionary, had been the de facto leader of the Republic for over 2 decades. His policies of peace and trade had brought unprecedented prosperity, but now those same policies appeared to have left the nation defenseless against its enemies. The people who had once celebrated his achievements now cursed his name in the streets. Cornelius de Witt, Johann's older brother, was equally prominent in Dutch society. Born into wealth and privilege in Dordrecht, he had built a reputation as both a capable administrator and a war hero. His courage in naval battles against the English had earned him national recognition, while his position as bailiff gave him significant judicial authority. But like his brother, Cornelius found himself swimming against a tide of public opinion that threatened to drown them both. The brothers represented something that had become deeply unpopular among the Dutch masses. They were Republicans in an age when people were crying out for monarchical leadership. They supported the merchant class when citizens wanted military heroes. Most dangerously, they opposed the rise of William III of Orange, the young prince whom many saw as the nation's salvation. William III was everything the de Witt brothers were not. Young, charismatic, and blessed with royal blood, he embodied the strong leadership that desperate people craved. His supporters, known as Orangists, had been working for years to undermine the Republican government and restore the House of Orange to power. The military disasters of 1672 gave them the perfect opportunity to strike. The campaign against the de Witt brothers was methodical and ruthless. Pamphlets flooded the streets accusing them of secret negotiations with the French enemy. Rumours spread that they had deliberately sabotaged Dutch defences to facilitate a foreign invasion. Every military setback was blamed on their policies, every casualty laid at their feet. The propaganda machine worked with devastating efficiency, transforming two patriots into traitors in the public mind. Cornelius became the first target of this orchestrated assault. In July 1672, he was arrested on charges of plotting to assassinate William III of Orange. The accusations were fabricated, built on the testimony of a known criminal who had been promised a reward for his cooperation. But truth mattered little in the fevered atmosphere of that summer. The mere fact of his arrest was taken as proof of his guilt by a population hungry for scapegoats. The interrogation of Cornelius de Witt revealed the depths of political desperation gripping the Republic. Despite his advanced age and declining health, he was subjected to brutal torture designed to extract a confession. His interrogators applied thumbscrews that crushed the bones in his fingers, stretched him on the rack until his joints separated, and employed water torture that brought him to the edge of drowning repeatedly. Through it all, Cornelius maintained his innocence. Hour after hour of agony failed to break his spirit or produce the confession his enemies desperately wanted. His refusal to admit guilt only fueled the rage of his accusers, who interpreted his silence as further evidence of his treachery. How dare he continue to lie even while experiencing such righteous punishment? The torture sessions became a form of theatre, with officials and curious onlookers gathering to witness the interrogation of the fallen politician. These audiences weren't seeking justice, but entertainment, drawn by the spectacle of a once powerful man reduced to helpless suffering. Their presence transformed what should have been a judicial procedure into a sadistic carnival that prefigured the horrors to come. When torture failed to produce the desired confession, the authorities settled for a compromise. Cornelius was sentenced to exile rather than death, a punishment that allowed them to remove him from power while avoiding the appearance of executing an innocent man. But even this relatively merciful sentence wouldn't save him from the mob's fury that was already building in the streets outside his prison cell. The propaganda campaign against the brothers reached its climax in the days following Cornelius's sentencing. Inflammatory pamphlets depicted them as monsters who had sold their country to foreign enemies. Street preachers delivered sermons comparing them to Judas Iscariot, betrayers of their own people for 30 pieces of silver. Every tavern and marketplace buzzed with increasingly elaborate tales of their supposed crimes. The mood in The Hague had become genuinely dangerous by August 20th, 1672. Groups of angry citizens gathered on street corners, their conversations growing more heated with each passing hour. Weapons appeared in hands that had previously held only tools of honest labor. The authorities recognized the signs of impending violence, but seemed paralyzed by indecision, unwilling or unable to take decisive action to prevent the catastrophe that was clearly approaching. Johann de Witt was well aware of the danger surrounding his family, but he couldn't abandon his brother in his hour of need. Despite warnings from friends and allies, he made the fateful decision to visit Cornelius in prison one last time. Perhaps he hoped to arrange some form of protection, or maybe he simply wanted to offer comfort to a man who had already suffered so much. Whatever his motivations, that decision would seal both their fates. The prison that held Cornelius de Witt was located in the heart of The Hague, surrounded by the very neighborhoods where anti-republican sentiment burned hottest. Word of Johann's arrival spread through the streets with lightning speed, carried by watchers who had been monitoring the situation for weeks. Within minutes, the prison was surrounded by an ever-growing crowd, whose mood grew uglier with each passing moment. The crowd outside the prison walls wasn't just angry. They were intoxicated by the scent of blood that hadn't yet been spilled, their collective consciousness merging into something far more dangerous than the sum of its parts. These weren't hardened criminals or professional soldiers. These were shopkeepers and craftsmen, mothers and fathers, ordinary citizens transformed into something unrecognizable by months of carefully cultivated hatred. What began as scattered shouting soon escalated into a coordinated assault on the prison itself. The mob had come prepared with tools and weapons, suggesting this wasn't a spontaneous uprising, but a planned execution disguised as popular justice. Hammers and axes appeared in hands that moments before had seemed empty. Ropes materialized as if summoned by dark magic. The crowd moved with the practiced efficiency of predators who had been stalking their prey for weeks. The guards at the prison found themselves overwhelmed within minutes, These men, trained to handle individual prisoners or small disturbances, were utterly unprepared for the tsunami, then faced the murmur of rage that crashed against immediately, abandoning their posts rather their gates. Some fled a horde. Others attempted to maintain order, but were quickly swept aside by sheer numbers and ferocity. Inside his cell, Cornelius de Witt could hear the approaching storm, the sound of splintering wood, breaking glass, and inhuman roars penetrated the thick stone walls that had seemed so secure just moments before. His brother Johann, who had arrived hoping to provide comfort, now found himself trapped in what was rapidly becoming a death chamber. The brothers had perhaps 15 minutes to contemplate their fate as the mob worked to break down the final barriers, separating them from their victims. 15 minutes to reflect on lives dedicated to public service, now ending in the most public and brutal way imaginable. Did they pray? Did they curse their enemies? Did they simply hold each other as the sounds of destruction grew ever closer? When the cell door finally burst open, the scene that greeted the mob exceeded even their bloodthirsty expectations. Two of the most powerful men in the Dutch Republic stood before them, helpless and afraid. The psychological impact was intoxicating. Here were the architects of their misery, the traitors who had sold their country to foreign enemies, finally at their mercy. But mercy was the furthest thing from the crowd's collective mind. What followed was not an execution, but a ritualistic destruction of everything the de Witt brothers represented. The mob didn't simply want them dead. They wanted them erased, obliterated so completely that nothing would remain to remind future generations of their existence. The brothers were dragged from their cell with a violence that spoke to something primal and terrifying in human nature. Hands tore at their clothing, their hair, their flesh. Every person in that howling mass seemed determined to inflict personal damage, to claim their piece of the destruction. The very air seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy that transformed ordinary citizens into instruments of torture. Johann and Cornelius were beaten with whatever weapons the crowd could find. Hammers crushed bones with sickening cracks that echoed through the prison corridors. Knives sliced through flesh with the precision of butchers preparing meat for market. The brothers' screams mixed with the roars of their attackers, creating a symphony of horror that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. But the physical violence was only the beginning of their ordeal. The mob seemed intent on destroying not just their bodies, but their very humanity. They were stripped naked, their dignity torn away along with their clothing. Every mark of their former status was systematically removed, reducing them from respected statesmen to bleeding, helpless victims. The crowd's behavior revealed something deeply disturbing about the nature of mob psychology. Individual restraints that might have prevented such brutality simply evaporated in the face of collective madness. People who would never have harmed a fly in their normal lives became savage participants in torture that exceeded anything found in medieval dungeons. As the brothers weakened from their injuries, the mob's attention turned to more elaborate forms of humiliation. They weren't content with simple murder. They wanted spectacle, theatre, a show that would satisfy their hunger for revenge, while entertaining the growing audience of spectators who had gathered to witness the carnage. The decision to move the torture outside transformed a prison break into a public festival of cruelty. The brothers were dragged through the streets of The Hague, their broken bodies leaving trails of blood on cobblestones that would be scrubbed clean within hours. Citizens emerged from their homes to witness the procession, some cheering, others watching in horrified fascination. The improvised gibbet erected in the public square represented the mob's desire to make their vengeance permanent and visible. This wasn't just about killing the de Witt brothers. It was about sending a message to anyone who might dare oppose the will of the people. The structure itself was crude but effective, designed more for displaying corpses than for efficient execution. When the brothers were finally hanged, their suffering should have ended. But the mob had other plans. Death was merely the beginning of a new phase of brutality that would push the boundaries of human cruelty to their absolute limits. What happened next would shock even hardened observers who thought they had seen everything. The decision to hang the bodies upside down wasn't random. It was a deliberate inversion of normal burial practices designed to deny the brothers even the dignity of proper death. In the medieval mindset, the orientation of a corpse carried deep spiritual significance. By inverting their bodies, the mob was symbolically condemning their souls along with their flesh. But even this grotesque display wasn't enough to satisfy the crowd's bloodlust. What followed was a systematic dismemberment that transformed the De Witt brothers into macabre souvenirs. Fingers were severed with kitchen knives and sold to eager buyers who wanted physical mementos of the day's excitement. Ears were sliced off and pocketed by those who arrived too late to claim better prizes. The commercialization of the brothers' remains revealed something particularly chilling about the mob's mentality. This wasn't just mindless violence, but calculated exploitation of human suffering for profit. Vendors appeared as if from nowhere, hawking pieces of the corpses like merchants selling trinkets at a country fair. The sacred and the commercial merged in ways that defied comprehension. Even more disturbing were the reports of cannibalism that emerged from multiple witnesses. In their frenzy to possess and consume their victims, some members of the mob apparently crossed the final taboo of civilized society. Hearts were cut from chests and eaten raw. Other organs were distributed among the crowd like communion elements in some satanic ritual. These accounts of cannibalism, documented by horrified observers, represented the absolute nadir of human behavior. The transformation was complete. Citizens of one of Europe's most civilized republics had devolved into something that belonged in humanity's darkest prehistory. The thin veneer of culture and religion had been stripped away to reveal the beast that lurked beneath. The scene that greeted dawn on August 21st defied every principle of human decency that had supposedly separated civilized society from the barbarism of darker ages. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the public square, they revealed a tableau so horrific that even hardened soldiers who had witnessed the brutalities of war turned away in disgust. The improvised gibbet stood like a monument to mankind's capacity for evil, its gruesome cargo swaying gently in the morning breeze. But the true horror lay not in what remained hanging from those crude wooden beams, but in what had been systematically removed during the night's orgy of violence. The corpses that dangled upside down bore little resemblance to the distinguished statesmen who had entered that prison cell less than 24 hours earlier. They had been transformed into something that challenged the very definition of human remains. The methodical nature of the mutilation suggested this wasn't random savagery, but deliberate desecration following some twisted logic known only to the mob. Every digit had been severed with surgical precision, creating wounds that spoke to hours of careful work rather than frenzied hacking. The removal of facial features had been equally systematic, transforming recognizable countenances into anonymous masks of horror. What made the scene even more disturbing was the carnival atmosphere that had developed around the gibbet. Vendors had set up stalls nearby, selling food and drink to spectators who treated the display like entertainment rather than tragedy. Children played games in the shadow of the hanging corpses while their parents conducted normal business, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The psychological impact on witnesses would prove lasting and profound. A Venetian diplomat who glimpsed the scene wrote in his private correspondence that the sight had given him nightmares for weeks, describing imagery so disturbing that he struggled to find words adequate to convey the horror. French ambassadors reported similar reactions, suggesting that news of the atrocity was already spreading beyond Dutch borders. Yet perhaps most chilling was the reaction of ordinary citizens who had participated in or witnessed the violence. Rather than showing remorse or horror at what they had done, many seemed energized by the experience. They spoke of the night's events with pride rather than shame, as if they had performed some great service to their country rather than committed acts of unprecedented brutality. The transformation of the de Witt brothers into objects of commerce revealed something particularly sinister about human nature. Body parts weren't just being sold as souvenirs, but were being treated as relics with almost religious significance. Buyers spoke of possessing pieces of the traitors as talismans that would protect their families from future betrayal. The sacred and profane had merged in ways that defied rational comprehension. Medical knowledge of the period meant that the brothers had likely remained conscious far longer than modern victims would under similar circumstances. Without understanding of shock or blood loss, their torturers had unwittingly prolonged suffering beyond what should have been physically possible. Each cut, each blow, each act of mutilation had been experienced with full awareness until the very end. The involvement of women and children in the violence added another layer of horror to an already unthinkable situation. Contemporary accounts describe mothers holding up their infants to better see the spectacle, while young children competed to collect drops of blood, as if they were playing some innocent game. The corruption of innocence seemed as complete as the destruction of the victims themselves. Religious authorities found themselves in an impossible position as news of the atrocity spread. The very citizens who attended church services on Sunday had participated in acts that violated every principle of Christian mercy and forgiveness. Sermons in the weeks following the massacre struggled to address the contradiction between professed faith and demonstrated behavior. The speed with which normal social bonds had dissolved during the crisis revealed how fragile civilization truly was. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades had been transformed overnight into participants in ritualistic murder. The mechanisms that usually prevented such violence had simply evaporated when faced with sufficient collective rage. International observers struggled to comprehend how the Dutch Republic, renowned throughout Europe for its religious tolerance and commercial sophistication, could have produced such barbarity. The contrast between the nation's reputation and the reality of what had occurred in The Hague created a cognitive dissonance that challenged fundamental assumptions about progress and civilization. The physical evidence of the massacre would haunt the city for years to come. Despite efforts to clean the square, stains remained visible on the cobblestones long after the gibbet had been removed. Local residents reported strange sounds emanating from the area at night, though whether these were genuine supernatural phenomena or psychological manifestations of collective guilt remained unclear. The preservation of certain body parts in turpentine created permanent reminders of the night's horror. These grotesque trophies, displayed in private collections or passed down through families, ensured that the memory of the violence would persist long after the political circumstances that had motivated it had been forgotten. They became physical manifestations of humanity's capacity for evil, but perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire episode was how quickly it had been normalized within Dutch society. Within weeks of the massacre, the same citizens who had participated in or witnessed the violence had returned to their normal routines, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The capacity to compartmentalize such extreme behavior suggested something deeply troubling about human psychology. The artistic response to the massacre would prove as controversial as the event itself. When rumors began circulating that a painter had been present during the violence, creating a visual record of the horror, reactions ranged from fascination to revulsion. The idea that someone had transformed human suffering into art challenged conventional boundaries between documentation and exploitation. The identity of this mysterious artist became a subject of intense speculation. Some claimed it was Jan de Been, a respected portraitist known for his connections to prominent political figures. Others suggested it might have been an unknown painter who had witnessed the scene by accident and felt compelled to record what he had seen. The anonymity only added to the painting's disturbing power. The technical skill required to capture such a scene under torchlight, working quickly while surrounded by a violent mob, suggested an artist of considerable talent and remarkable composure. the ability to focus on aesthetic considerations while witnessing such brutality spoke to either extraordinary professional dedication or a psychological detachment that was almost as disturbing as the violence itself. The painting's composition revealed careful attention to symbolic details that elevated it beyond mere documentation. The positioning of the torchbearer, the arrangement of the corpses, the inclusion of background elements all suggested deliberate artistic choices rather than hasty recording. This transformation of horror into art raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between suffering and beauty. The inscription on the back of the canvas, identifying the subjects and providing specific timing, gave the work an immediacy that was both compelling and horrifying. The matter-of-fact tone of the text contrasted sharply with the emotional impact of the imagery, creating a tension that amplified the painting's psychological effect on viewers. The decision to paint the scene at 11 o'clock at night, rather than waiting for better lighting conditions, suggested an urgency that went beyond artistic considerations. Perhaps the painter understood that what he was witnessing represented a moment of such historical significance that it demanded immediate documentation, regardless of technical difficulties. The level of anatomical detail visible in the painting indicated either extensive medical knowledge or careful observation during the actual mutilation. The precision with which wounds, missing body parts, and physical deformities were rendered suggested the artist had studied his subjects extensively, possibly returning multiple times to ensure accuracy. The psychological impact of viewing the completed work proved almost as disturbing as witnessing the original scene. Visitors to galleries where it was eventually displayed reported physical reactions ranging from nausea to fainting. The painting's power to recreate the horror of that August night seemed to transcend normal artistic boundaries. The work's historical value as documentation of political violence made it impossible to dismiss despite its disturbing content. Scholars recognized that it provided unique insight into both the specific events of 1672 and the broader phenomenon of mob psychology during periods of social crisis. The painting became an unwilling witness to humanity's darkest impulses. The technical challenges of creating such a work under the circumstances made its very existence remarkable. Working by torchlight while surrounded by a violent crowd, the artist had somehow managed to maintain the steady hand and careful observation necessary to produce a work of genuine artistic merit. The achievement was as impressive as it was horrifying. The painting's survival through centuries of political upheaval and changing artistic tastes testified to its enduring power to shock and disturb viewers. Unlike other historical artworks that had lost their emotional impact over time, this work seemed to retain its ability to evoke visceral reactions from contemporary audiences. The ethical questions raised by the painting's existence would persist long after its creation. Was the artist's decision to document rather than intervene a betrayal of basic human decency? Or did the historical value of such documentation justify the apparent callousness required to create it? These questions had no easy answers. The work's influence on subsequent artistic depictions of violence and political upheaval would prove significant but controversial. Later artists studying the painting learned techniques for representing extreme human suffering that would inform their own approaches to difficult subjects. The knowledge came at the cost of confronting imagery that challenged their own psychological resilience. The painting's location in museum collections raised additional ethical considerations. Should such disturbing content be displayed publicly, potentially traumatizing unsuspecting viewers? Or did its historical significance override concerns about psychological impact? These debates would continue for centuries without resolution. The technical preservation of the work presented unique challenges due to both its age and its disturbing subject matter. Conservation efforts required specialists willing to spend extended periods studying and working on imagery that most people could barely tolerate viewing briefly. The psychological toll on these professionals became a consideration in its own right. The revelation that such detailed documentation existed sent shockwaves through Dutch society that extended far beyond artistic circles. Government officials, already struggling to maintain order in the aftermath of the massacre, found themselves confronting a new crisis. How could they allow such graphic evidence of their citizens' barbarity to circulate freely? Yet how could they suppress what was increasingly being recognized as historically significant documentation? The painting's very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilization itself. Here was visual proof that the most advanced society in Europe could descend into savagery that exceeded anything found in the darkest corners of human history. The implications were staggering for a nation that had built its identity on principles of tolerance, reason, and commercial sophistication. Religious leaders found themselves grappling with theological questions that had no precedent in their training. If God's chosen people could commit such atrocities, what did this say about divine providence? Sermons struggled to reconcile the massacre with Christian doctrine, often resorting to comparisons with biblical accounts of divine wrath to make sense of the incomprehensible. The international diplomatic consequences proved equally complex. Foreign ambassadors reporting back to their capitals struggled to convey the full horror of what they had witnessed or heard described. How could they explain to their monarchs that the sophisticated Dutch Republic, Europe's beacon of religious freedom, had produced citizens capable of such medieval brutality? French intelligence operatives saw opportunity in the chaos. Reports reaching Versailles suggested that Dutch society was far more fragile than previously understood. If respected statesmen could be torn apart by their own citizens, what did this suggest about the Republic's ability to resist foreign invasion? The massacre became a factor in military planning that extended far beyond Dutch borders. English observers reacted with a mixture of horror and satisfaction. Their longtime commercial rivals had revealed themselves capable of barbarism that exceeded anything in recent English history. Yet thoughtful commentators recognized that similar conditions might produce comparable results in London. The violence served as both condemnation of Dutch society and warning about the fragility of all civilized institutions. The Spanish court, still smarting from military defeats at Dutch hands, struggled to balance satisfaction at their enemies' internal strife with genuine revulsion at the described atrocities. Catholic theologians wrote treatises suggesting that Protestant heresy had inevitably led to moral corruption, though they carefully avoided dwelling on similar violence in their own territories. Medical practitioners who examined surviving evidence of the massacre found themselves confronting injuries that challenged their understanding of human anatomy. The systematic nature of the mutilations suggested knowledge of physiology that went beyond random violence. Someone in that mob had possessed surgical skills that enabled prolonged torture without immediate death. The precision of certain amputations indicated the use of proper medical instruments rather than crude weapons. This discovery raised disturbing questions about the participation of trained physicians in the violence. Had doctors, sworn to heal and preserve life, actively participated in systematic torture? The implications for medical ethics were profound and troubling. Contemporary anatomical drawings attempting to document the injuries proved so disturbing that most were destroyed shortly after creation. The few that survived were locked away in private collections, deemed too graphic for scholarly circulation. These medical documents became as controversial as the painting itself. The speed with which professional embalmers had appeared to preserve certain organs suggested premeditation that went beyond spontaneous mob violence. Someone had planned for the creation of permanent trophies, organizing the necessary materials and expertise in advance. The massacre had been choreographed as carefully as a theatrical performance. Toxicological analysis of preserved tissue samples revealed the presence of unusual substances that might have been administered to prolong consciousness during torture. While primitive by modern standards, Dutch physicians possessed knowledge of drugs that could maintain awareness while preventing death from shock. The possibility that such knowledge had been deliberately applied added another layer of horror to an already unthinkable crime. The psychological aftermath proved as complex as the immediate violence. Participants in the massacre experienced a range of reactions that defied easy categorization. Some showed clear signs of what modern psychology would recognize as trauma, unable to sleep or function normally after their participation in such extreme violence. Others seemed energized by the experience, speaking obsessively about the night's events and seeking opportunities to relive the excitement through detailed retellings. These individuals appeared to have crossed some fundamental psychological boundary that separated them permanently from normal human empathy. They had tasted something that transformed their basic nature. A third group attempted to rationalize their participation through elaborate justifications that portrayed the violence as patriotic duty rather than criminal brutality. These individuals developed complex mythologies that cast themselves as heroes defending their homeland against treason. The psychological gymnastics required to maintain such delusions revealed the human mind's remarkable capacity for self-deception. The massacre of the Witt brothers stands as one of history's most chilling reminders that civilization is nothing more than a fragile mask concealing humanity's darkest impulses. What began as political opposition transformed into ritualistic savagery that defied every principle of human decency. The painting that immortalized their suffering continues to haunt viewers centuries later, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own capacity for evil. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how quickly an advanced society returned to normalcy after witnessing such unprecedented brutality, suggesting that the beast within us all is never truly tamed.